So thanks very much for joining us today, everyone. This is Goodman Masson's third diversity and inclusion webinar. Today we're going to be focused on diversity data. We've seen a huge increase in questions coming through from our clients around diversity data, both about Goodman Masson's diversity data for us as an organisation and for the data around our applicants as they kind of progress through the recruitment process. So just to introduce myself before we kick off, my name's Kellaway. I'm a director at Goodman Masson. I've been in recruitment for 12 years now, and over the last year I've had the pleasure of working with Lenna on Goodman Masson's diversity and inclusion change programme. Now, part of that programme is Goodman Masson have made a commitment to develop and share content with our clients that adds value around the topic of diversity and inclusion. So we will record the session today and we'll send it out afterwards. And we're happy to kind of pick up any questions which are more specific. We have assumed some knowledge as we move through the presentation today, just so we can get into some of the meatier parts of the topic. If you do have any questions as we walk through the presentation, just pop them in the chat box and we'll answer as many as possible at the end.
Great, and I'm Lenna Cumberbatch. I'm a non-executive director at Goodman Masson for Diversity, Inclusion and Respect. I'm also doing my PhD currently in Diversity, Inclusion, Strategic Change. I've been working in and out of diversity and inclusion for probably about 25 years in both the UK, in the EU and in the US. So a bit of experience here, and it's just been an absolute pleasure working at Goodman Masson over the past few months in terms of taking this agenda forward. So we'll be going through quite a bit today, but we'll run you through the contents generally for our schedules today.
So we're going to firstly start with the why. Why do we need to collect diversity data? Then we'll move on to who do we collect the diversity data from and what are we asking from those people? And then practically, when do we collect data and how do we collect it? And then the really exciting bit, once you've got the data, what do we do with it and how do you make the most of it?
Absolutely. So let's start with the why. We've been learning a lot about equality lately. We know that there's in inequality lately. We know there's a gender pay gap, which is approximately 15.5%, depending on the age group. We know that there's also an ethnicity pay gap, and that can be up to 16%, and that's for Pakistani group. And so that's another area we've been collecting data for this. And we also have seen the impact on health, particularly related to COVID-19 and the disproportionate effect on people who are disabled and people who are from a minority ethnic background, and also in association with maternal mortality rate, which you've seen in a recent report from the Women in Inequalities Party, but also in the criminal justice system. So these are real world reasons why collecting data is so key and so important to what we do. But we've got a series of business reasons as well. I mean, it's not just these reasons as well.
Yeah, I think, when we say kind of why, there's three key reasons. So, we need to understand, firstly, we need to understand who we're working with. If we don't know we don't know who we're working with, how do we know what they want? So with this in mind, we need to collect data from right across an organisation's reach, so from employees through to customers and clients and partners and investors, making sure that we're understanding that whole reach of an organisation. And then another kind of key important, we know, as Lenna said, that there is inequality, and as employers we've got that responsibility to address inequality in the workplace, and we can do that by looking at the remuneration, opportunity. So there's various ways that we can start to address that inequality. And then a third reason is we need to actually measure our progress. By collecting data, it allows us to hold ourselves accountable and review the efforts that we are putting into improvements and see that we can actually that the work that we've done has achieved something.
Absolutely. And we move on to looking at these reasons, looking at practical examples to provide for you. For example, Tom Borrell Communications now, which is one of the world's largest multicultural communication companies, but Tom started out at a small advertising firm, Wade Advertising, and in the advertising firm, they would design this and produce this advert with a white cast and audience, and then they would just recast the entire set and just put black people in places of those white people in that ad. And he was saying, black people are not dark-skinned white people, understanding the difference that it creates. And so you can see that even today we do marketing. There's the recent furore around the John Boyega ad, which he wrote, he directed, and he starred in, and it was about his life, his experience growing up in Peckham, and his experience. And what the company then did was they picked up his story And for a Chinese market, they replaced him with a Chinese actor and set it in a Chinese setting. And so it's really important to understand that you can't just pick up and put somebody else in a different place. And Tom created this massive successful advertising campaign in America, which really followed the life and experience of a young man from at a young age entering the fast food market change and becoming a manager in that space, very successful. And so just understanding that the importance of having Tom in that role gave him insight into a different market that they didn't already have. And similarly for Out Loud Marketing Agency, they've said here our gay marketing campaigns have helped mainstream brands, charities and government organizations reach new audiences and engage with this demographic. The pink pound became really important, being understanding. And because they knew how to target this particular market, they were able to capitalize on this opportunity and experience. That's not to say that they're the only ones who could do that, but when you've got that experience yourselves, the authenticity really adds to what you can accomplish and what you can achieve. And then looking at some statistics that we've received more broadly.
Yeah, so I think the McGregor-Smith review is a really powerful understanding in terms of that link that we could be more successful if we have more representation. So I think they pointed out that we could be £24 billion better off a year as a UK economy if we had full representation of BME individuals in the workforce, which is just huge. And I think looking at McKinsey and company, they've done some fantastic analysis around the link between diversity and commercial success. So a study they did in 2018 found that those organisations that were in the bottom quartile for gender and cultural diversity were 29% less likely to achieve above average profitability. So not only were those organisations with the least diversity in terms of gender and ethnic cultural diversity not leading the market, they were actually lagging behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that in a number of different ways. And just to give you another example, I mean, we're really hitting hard on the whys here because it's really important to understand why this is important. But looking at retention, we know that if employees, turnover can cost up to 200% of an employee's annual salary, depending on the role, from Harvard Business Review in 2017. And for customers, increasing customer retention rates by 5% increases profits by 25% to 95%. And again, Harvard Business Review, that's 2018. If people are comfortable with you, they stay. And they come back, and that's really key in what we're doing in all of this work. So looking at this now, another reason is don't assume you know your diversity demographics. Diversity is not always visible. You may have heard the term invisible disabilities, and that can include mental health diagnoses, neurodiversity, arthritis, etc. But invisibility can be true for all the protected characteristics: age, gender, reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy, maternity, race, religion, belief, sex and sexual orientation. You don't know who's in the room until you ask. So it's really important to ask so that you understand first of all. All right, so now that we've covered the why areas, let's start looking at the who.
So we've already kind of started to make this point, but you'll see, as we talk about who and where we collect data from, it's that whole reach of an organisation that we want to make really clear. So I think the kind of most common place that people start with when they think about diversity and inclusion data is employees. And I think when we start with that, we want to kind of think about, are we reaching everyone? Employees aren't one group. There's very different experience of different employees, whether it's, the experience of different functions within an organisation or different levels. So in terms of making sure that we actually think about that when we're designing our diversity and inclusion surveys.
Yeah.
And then coming on to suppliers, I think, the question here to us is what do we understand about our suppliers and their approach to diversity and inclusion? Do they align with our values? And that's something that, as I mentioned, Goodman Masson have seen an increase in clients that we work with, who we supply to, asking Goodman Masson about our demographic makeup and also our approach to diversity and inclusion. So I think a really good question that, you can use your buying power to understand the approach that your suppliers are taking to diversity and inclusion.
Absolutely. I think it's really key. You may not have the power to ask everybody about their actual demographics, but you can certainly ask them if your values align.
Yeah.
And so then we're looking outside of the organization. And so in terms of what we're doing and putting information out there, so looking at things like publicity, and that's going to be the actors and the models who are in your publicity, in your materials, but also the destinations where you're putting your advertising materials, what sort of magazines, what sort of websites, so who are you sending your materials to? Then you're looking at your customers. Now, these will be customers who are in person, who come into your shop front, who come to your events, and then also who call you for support or help on the phone. Beyond that, we're looking at the applicants in your organization who come to you for a job or for a position or a place. And we want to look at them at all the stages across their job roles. And so you're looking at their application stage, the shortlist stage, the interview, the hired. Is the same demographics who are applying being hired at the same percentage rate? And we'll go into that a little bit later in the next slide, later on in a few slides. So looking now at the what of what we're collecting. So these are the protected characteristics, and I mentioned them before: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, nationality, religion and belief, sex and sexual orientation. Now these come directly from the Equality Act 2010. And so it's really important to keep in mind that in addition to the importance of diversity and inclusion generally, there are legal obligations associated with them as well. Now, that doesn't mean that we collect data on every single one of these demographics. For example, I think it's really important to start with the first four. And so just to example your age, so of those questions that they could look like. What is your age, and or in what age group are you? So for example, what is your age? I like, because I'm a data person, I like numbers. It means I can do, if you give them a raw number, put them a blank where they can put the actual number, is it 37, 52, 12, whatever it is. It means I can do a median and I can do a mean and I do proper calculations. Most people won't need that. Most people want to do an age group, and they'll do groups of 5, 20 to 24, 25 to 29. Don't make the mistake of overlapping your numbers. But I think it's really important to consider what you need from that data. And so there are different times where you need to use different age ranges for you. For example, there is a big difference between somebody's 20 and somebody's 24 in university, not in universities, for example. Looking then at next question would be, do you consider yourself to be disabled? And that's the social model of disability. It's really important to understand the differentiation between the way the government currently asks that question, which is on the medical model, and whether or not you have an impairment. With social model of disability says that you are disabled by society. Yes, I have an impairment, part of my body, whatever it is. But the important part is whether or not our world enables is accessible for you to access. And so that's the key point there. Then you're looking at what is your ethnic group, and then also what is your gender. And I've put sex so you know what I mean in terms of the Equality Act, but we use gender. That's what's recommended by Stonewall, by Mermaids, the UK government. There is a debate on this, but I think it's really important to understand that gender will be the least confusing option if you put down gender and male, female. Now, male, gender and disability have statutory requirements in terms of how you complete those questions. And so that's why I put stars there. You may be collecting that information already for HR, and so for reasonable adjustments for disability, and for rate and revenue customs for gender. These are the 4 minimums that I would recommend you collect in terms of any sort of diversity data collection. However, you can collect the other data, and they're useful information, but it's really important in terms of GDPR that you're asking these questions if you're going to do something about it. So in terms of transgender gender reassignment, you ask, is your gender identity the same as it was assigned at birth? And you don't ask if somebody's trans, because if you are a person who has transitioned, then you may not identify as trans. You may identify now as your gender identity that you identify with now. Then you can ask, how would you describe your sexual orientation? And it's sexual orientation, not sexuality. And then also, do you have a religion or belief? Now, the thing about these last 3 is that they can be such small numbers that unless you're going to use that information, I wouldn't ask it, because otherwise you risk identifying the individual, and and being able to make big decisions about small numbers can be difficult. Now, if you have a pattern where all of these groups are having a terrible experience, then that's quite a big picture for you to understand and know, and know that you need to do something about. And then finally, the final demographic questions that I was asked, do you have caring responsibilities for a child with additional support needs, or another adult? And you can break that question up into separate parts. You can make this a yes or no question, and then have check boxes for the particular items if that's useful. And then, what is the highest level of education your parents or guardians have received? Now, this is a proxy question for socioeconomic background. And, it's a way of asking that question. It's not perfect. There aren't perfect questions for this, but it's a way of garnering an answer to that if it's useful for you. It's not a protected, neither of these are protected characteristics, but they may be useful in terms of the work that you're doing. Please also add a prefer not to answer option. That means you can make all of your questions mandatory without any troubles because they can prefer not to answer. And then also put the demographics at the end of the survey. There's a cause of this is something called stereotype threat, which is where you remind somebody of their identity before they answer questions. It may change the way they answer those questions. So put them at the end, and that way you get their first initial response to your questions, and then they answer the demographic questions at the end.
I thought that was so interesting.
It's an interesting piece, isn't it? So looking next at one more, gone too far forwards. But yeah, so looking next, we've asked the demographic information, but then there's also that inclusion piece, Catherine. I think that's really important as well.
So in terms of collecting inclusion data, a good practice approach with collecting this data is to have a 5-point Likert scale, where you have strongly agree at one end, strongly disagree at another end, and a neutral option for neither agree or disagree. I think a key point here is that there's no right or wrong answer. You're trying to understand somebody's opinion and their experience of working within the organisation. So when we come to look at employees, the kind of questions we might ask are, how does somebody feel about the organisation that they work in? Are my skills valued? Have I got opportunities to grow within an organisation? You know, I would recommend this organisation as a good place to work. And something interesting that Lenna pointed out, you know, you might have that question, I feel welcomed in my team, and then have another similar question, I feel welcomed in my company. To be able to, the reason you have those two similar questions is to understand the difference between, you know, someone might feel welcomed by their company but not welcomed by their team. And if there is that difference, that's something that you want to understand. So thinking about the different layers of inclusion questions is important. Other development areas around other areas of inclusion might include bullying and harassment, maternity, paternity, carer or long-term sick leave, satisfaction with appraisals and career development, and how much of those kind of questions you decide to include is up to your organisation in terms of where you are up to with those kind of policies and procedures in your organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just moving on from that, looking at the experience of not just your employees, but also of customers. And so again, on the 5-point Likert scale, I was treated well, I was satisfied with my contact with employees, I would return, I would recommend. We've seen those, you know, if you've got, if you like what you've seen, please tell your friends. If you don't, please tell us. That, you know, it's a formal way of collecting that, but it's also being able to say, is the experience of this person similar to the experience of this person? How are different demographic groups having different experiences? But then also remember to include and not applicable where appropriate. That won't be, don't automatically include it, but check. Can this question always be answered by somebody? And if not, include a not applicable option, but don't always include it as a result. So then looking now then, finally, just in terms of structure, be careful of 2-part questions. When you include an and, then you're giving people an option. My skills are valued by my manager and the company. Well, what if they're valued by the manager, but I don't know about the company and I feel welcome and respected? What I felt really welcomed, but people are really disrespectful to me in other areas. And so make sure that you have a one single question in your question and not that they're not 2-parters. Right, so next section, when and how. Looking at our next section. So first of all, when we're starting to ask these questions, always include a preamble. This is where you get to explain to people why you want them to complete this data. Why should they complete this data? Why it's important to you, and also your disclaimers. So why are you collecting this data? Include a statement of who will have access to the data. That's really important because we recommend that people know how this data is going to be used and who has access to it. If you're giving your experience, then you may not want people to know that it was you who gave your honest feedback. And so the opportunity to give that, make that external is really useful. We'll come into more detail on that in a moment. But that you're using these categories that you're using, so the language that I've just used is going to be aligned with UK or whatever your relevant country is and the statistics language that we use here. sometimes people's language that they use for how their identity doesn't match, and so we've seen that in the UK and the US, but also around the world. And then also a GDPR privacy statement and confirmation box that the statement has been read. I've not said consent here, and so for you, the GDPR folks, if you don't know, check with your GDPR person as to what would be most preferable for your use. You could use a statutory use statement as well. So when you're collecting employee data, the first place that you're going to do this is a part of your employee record. So this is going to include the person's actual identity. It'll have their name on it. And then you want to add to that their diversity demographic data. You can do this when they join the organization, but if you haven't started doing that yet, you'll need to do it for the first time for people who are already there. So you do that when they start the organization and then when you start collecting data. And then send an annual reminder just saying so people can update it, or if they didn't fill it in the last time you sent the reminder, they'll send it at this time. But it just means that you have a more complete employee data record. And actually this next aspect, I believe Goodman Masson are just starting out on this journey yourselves now, right, Catherine?
Yeah, so you've done some great work with us in terms of designing our survey for this. And I think an employee satisfaction survey with that kind of combination of inclusion and diversity data, so you can understand the experiences of different people within the organisation. I think something we've done a lot previously is very much an inclusion focused survey, but not necessarily looking at the different experiences of different demographic groups. And so I think that's going to be really powerful to understand. And I think, you know, then thinking about when do you need to send out that survey? You know, do you do it just before you review your strategy, so you can actually incorporate the findings into the strategy or into your strategic review? And then, as Lenna mentioned a moment ago, if you do have the opportunity to have the data, the raw data, externally managed, there's a huge benefit to that for people who are filling out the survey, who might be thinking, well, if I take this box, and this box, it's pretty clear who I am. And so they might kind of be less inclined to be as kind of direct with their feedback. So second to that, as Lenna mentioned, you know, you could, if you aren't able to get somebody externally to kind of manage that raw data and kind of send it back to you in report form, you could look to have a data controller and make clear who will have access to the raw data within your organisation, so that it's clear that that is the person, as opposed to it being as vague as management, for example.
Yeah, really important. That's really key. Okay, so collecting external data, and so that's, you know, the people who you work with outside of your organisation, as it were. And so one of my favourite ways of doing this on the spot was for an event, and we used a tablet. We just had 4 people with a tablet, and you would go around and you just ask people to complete the survey. Now, depending on how you want to need, I would recommend you use a percentage of random sampling. So, for example, if you know that you have 100 people who come through your door, then you ask every 10th person, you get 10%, approximately thereabouts, depending on how many people you've got on the time. But what that means is that the person collecting the data isn't biased against people, and they're not selecting people who they want to speak to. So they literally stand at the doorway and go 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 3, 5, up to 10, and then they pick number 10 and they ask them to complete the survey. Ask them to complete a survey, not a diversity survey. We found that makes a difference into whether or not people want to complete the survey. So just say, hey, would you take a moment? It's just 4 questions. Answer our survey, please. If you're going to put paper forms on chairs because you're having an event and you want people to fill them out at the time, then put them on every chair rather than skipping one, because otherwise what that will mean is that the people who really want to give you feedback will grab the forms off and they'll give you the feedback, and that might skew your data a little bit more. Also, manual data entry is tough and has a much higher error rate, so just be warned and careful of that as well. But you can also do this via email after your encounter. But first, remember, do you have permission to send them a survey? How did you get their email address? And, you know, have they agreed that you can send this to them? But then just send them a link to an online survey similar to the one that would have been on the tablet. And remember, for access reasons, give them the option. Say to them, you know, if you'd like an accessible copy of this, please let us know whenever possible. So, yeah.
So in terms of collecting applicant data, as I mentioned, this is something obviously Goodman Masson have seen firsthand in terms of applicants that we put forward for jobs. We've seen an increase in requests come through from our clients around diversity data for the applicant pools that we're putting forward. I think something that's really key here is that any diversity and inclusion questions that are about applicants need to make sure they're separate to the recruitment process, so they shouldn't be passed to the hiring manager to influence the decision in any way. Or, you know, you could enter into territories of potentially discrimination, you know, if you were to kind of use that information. So it's really important that information is kept separate from the recruitment process. How that can be done is, for example, you might have an anonymous code for each applicant, and then that data can be tracked through the recruitment process, which allows you to see the journey of different demographic groups through the recruitment process. And this is something that Goodman Masson has done a lot of work on, and we're actually about to publish our first finance diversity data that gives insight into different demographics groups through the recruitment process, and how you know, how the experience is different and what targets we're going to set ourselves as an organisation off the back of that data. So really powerful data, and then it's really important, you know, with all the data that you collect, to make sure that you do review the data you collect.
Yeah, just go back on a regular basis and look at it. There's no point in collecting this amazing collection of data and then not using it and checking back. We'll come back to that again later on when we talk about benchmarking. So let's get down into the what next part of it and getting into that data. So you've done all of this data collection, you've gone around, you've asked people lots of questions, and now you've got stuff that looks like this. So rows and rows and rows of data, and it can be dozens of rows, it can be hundreds of rows, it can be thousands, it can be tens of thousands of rows of data. So you can put little totals at the end, and you can make these lovely little charts that have the basic information that we need. And so this one's for attendance at a panel event, and you know, the panel format, the timing, the quality of the panel, or the ability of speakers, etc. The blue is excellent, orange is good, neither good nor boring in grey, and poor in yellow. You can see across the top there that pretty good, pretty happy, generally speaking, with lots of excellent in blue and lots of good in orange. And then in the second question, how likely are you to attend another event? At this bottom chart in blue, you've got neither likely nor likely, unlikely, but very likely. And most people are very likely to attend this event again, but does that really tell you anything? I mean, are you really able to gather much detail? I mean, are you hitting your target audience? And this can be demographic information. It can be also be, you know, based on the subject area. But what we really want to do is use that diversity demographic data to find out if we're getting into the people who we want to get to. So from this chart, you can see with blue is female, orange is male, and grey is non-binary, that the vast majority of all of these are female participants. And so you've got neither likely nor likely is green and grey, blue and grey, which is female and non-binary, and blue and orange for likely, and blue and orange again for very likely. But the majority of very likely are orange, which is blue. And so what you can see here is that your male participants and responders have had a much more positive experience of this particular event than your female applicants. And if the female respondents are your target audience, then shouldn't they be, you want them to have a better time? Or maybe you want to retarget your advertising to men, because men are obviously having a really good time at this particular event. But we can do better than that, right? And so let's look again. So we can apply this now to application data. And so we're looking at our application stages. This is for 4,045 applicants. And so we've got a good number of good data set here. So we're looking at application from left to right, application, shortlisted, interview, and placed. Female blue, male orange, other genders are in grey, and prefer not to answer in yellow. Now I've left out the numbers for grey and for other gender because they're quite tiny in this. But if you look across the bottom of this, you can see that 34.9, 34.0, 34.7 for female applicants is the percentage that they represent in this pool. And then at placed, they're at 60%. So somehow they've almost doubled their representation in the pool between the application and the place stage. Now, there are a number of reasons why that may be, and I'll come into that in a little bit more detail as we go through the next few slides. But it's interesting to look at this and see, okay, so we now have 60% of the people who are placed are female. But let's look at that into more detail. We've got 4,000 applicants plus, so we can break that down a little bit more. So let's look at this by ethnicity as well. And so this, we call this, you may have heard the term in the press there, intersectionality. So looking at the intersection between gender and ethnicity in here. So in this one, you can see, let's focus on what we've got here in terms of the white female population, because we know the female population increased. So we start out at 17%, at shortlisted with 20.5, interviewed 20.9, and placed at 35.3%. Now that's showing you that the white female population in the percentage representation in the population has doubled between application and placed. And you can see correspondingly that for the BAME female population, it's gone from 18% up to 26.5% at place level. So it's decreased at shortlisted and slightly increased at interview, but increased properly at place. But you can see the decrease there in the BAME male population, down from 29% to 5.9%. Before I get into the detail on why some of those things might be, let's have another look at it, even more detailed look at them. Because we've got the numbers in terms of number of applicants, we can really look at this, dig down. So we can break this down by properly, and we've broken it down by Black and Asian and mixed and multi-ethnic ethnic identities, along with our gender intersections. So let's start with the, oops, it's gone to the wrong one. So let's start with our Asian population, Asian female. And so across the bottom in blue and light blue, you've got 11% at application, shortlisted 8.9, interview 10, and placed at 12%. You know, there's approximately a 3 percentage point difference between application and place. So it's relatively stable. You know, it's minor increase, it's relatively stable. But if we look then at the Black male population, it starts at 8% of the population at application, 6.1% at shortlisted, 3.7% at interview, and is not represented in those positions that have been placed. And so this population disappears from the pool completely. And then finally, looking at that white female population once again, so that's 17% going up to 36. Now, they're not all going to add up exactly because not everybody chooses all of the demographics, but this is what we've got here in this sense. Now, what does this mean? I don't understand why this is happening, right? And so think about application as what's happening out there in the world. This is how your ad looks, what your ad looks like, the places where you put your ad. This looks at the population of the demographics of the area you're in, and it looks at the population of the pool from which you're drawing. So is this your graduate pool? Is this your regional pool? So, you know, is this Birmingham? So you've got a large Asian population. You know, where is it that this application information is coming from? That's going to be what you want is to reflect that in your application data. Shortlisted is whether or not their application meets your needs. So is the quality of their application up to the standards that you expect it to be? Now that can be under the criterion. Do you have objective measures that you are using to select for the criterion? And is this the standard and the style of the application itself completed? And then interview becomes where you start to choose people. You know, you've chosen the best of those shortlisted. You interview the best of those who are shortlisted. And then who you place is based on who you decide you like in that interview room. So these are the areas that you're thinking about when you're looking at that sort of data. So looking next, this is this is the next area of our analysis, really. Catherine, I think you're starting to do some work in this.
Yeah, so in terms of benchmarking, I think we have just got to a similar place where, you know, we've got that data from our applicants. We understand what that process looks like through the interview process. We now want to benchmark that against external measures. So we need to understand, you know, we can look at external data sets, whether it's the Office of National Statistics, whether it's graduate pools of data, whether it's specialist organisations such as organisations like Stonewall or Scope, for example, in relation to disability, to understand, you know, where does our data sit in comparison to the rest of the market? So are we good and looking to move to excellent, or we're actually average and actually our job is to get to good in the first place? So the question you'd be asking yourself there is, what does good look like for us at the moment? And if our starting point is actually we're at average, we've got a way to go to, you know, our first step is getting to good. So I think what you would then use to, once you've kind of got that benchmarking information, you'd then be looking to set targets for yourself. And with those targets, you can, like any targets, run complementary schemes. And something we're looking to do is use positive action. And we have been doing with clients. It's been really powerful to be able to use positive action once we've actually got that data to utilise it.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think really that understanding, I mean, in the slide we showed you before in terms of the, you know, the higher population of women in that area, is that because positive action has been used really well in that area. And so it's really interesting to look at the data and figure out what's going on in here and seeing the messages that we're delivering and receiving. I do want to reiterate, though, that you don't need to have data to be inclusive. I love my data, I love the information, and it's really important to be able to make changes that we understand where we actually sit, but you don't need data. You don't need to wait on it to be inclusive. So you can create an environment which is supportive and celebrative of your employees and customers. You can review your HR policies and procedures for D&I good practice. You can create or increase support for your employee networks, and you can ensure your customers can see themselves reflected in your team and in your promotional materials. Do that now. You could go through and audit all of your publicity materials today and say, oh, wow, yeah, this is the message that we're showing. And you can change that straight away. So remember, don't wait on the data to actually start making changes in this area. So just to summarize and bring you back to what we've covered today.
Yeah, so I think initially we focused on the why, and 3 key points there. Firstly, we need to understand the needs of all stakeholders and anyone that the organisation that you're working kind of comes into contact with. We want to address inequality, and the best way to do that is through understanding the data, and we want to be able to measure our progress once we've started collecting the data. And then moving on to the who and what, it's that whole picture again with the stakeholders and that whole reach picture that we're looking for. And we want to look at different demographics and those different demographics experience of inclusion. So we're looking at both diversity data and inclusion data for different groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we went through the why, done the why, and then looking at instead going through the when and the how. So when to collect data, and that's an application, but across all those different stages. When people visiting your premises, and we must be careful of GDPR and remember to analyze that data when you get to the end of it. But then look at that detailed data, looking at the benchmarking and comparing it to your competitors, comparing it to your region, comparing it to the benchmark, whichever benchmark you choose. And you can choose multiples, you can measure it to, and then setting your own targets in order to reach. And whether these are ambitious targets or not, that's up to you. They can be short-term ambitious and long-term, but remember to set them that they're realistic for you, and then review, go back, go over it again and again, each year maybe, or each 2 years, however long that is. But remember, there's no need to wait to be inclusive. So this has been our diversity data webinar. I hope this has been useful, and we're here now for questions. If you've got any, please feel free to ask. But if you've got anything in more depth that you're looking for, if you want to review, please feel free to get in touch with your contacts at Goodman Masson and ask them any questions they may be able to answer for you as well.
Yeah, definitely.